Mike, let me ask you a question. How would you catch them? We put the big honeypot out there, and all the flies came to us.
That was crafty con artist and big-time crook Mel Weinberg. And with the help of the FBI, he carried out one of the most unbelievable scams of all time. I'm talking fake Arab sheiks, hundreds of thousands of dollars in bribes, and corruption of the US government at the highest level. Don't believe me? The 7 congressmen Weinberg helped catch would say otherwise. To uncover this insane story, we need to go back to Weinberg's early life. This guy committed all sorts of strange crimes, like, selling 5,000 pairs of socks without any soles and buying up cheap glass only to stick "Made in Italy" stickers on it and sell it to Italian Americans. He once tried to cheat Yaqui Mexicans out of their gold mining rights and even silenced a cousin he'd cheated with a fake mob hit. Sounds like a nice guy, right? By the late 70s, he'd set up a firm, London Investors, and established fancy offices in Long Island, claiming to represent clients from Switzerland, England, and the Middle East. He had an English mistress called Evelyn Knight, drove a limousine, and the office phones were constantly ringing, though mostly from people who wanted their money back. Here he specialized in advance fee scams. A client, or more accurately Mark, would offer Weinberg $1,000 or more, which he would then process. In return, Weinberg promised to secure them million-dollar loans from overseas banks for people with bad credit. Only these loans, like the banks, were completely made up. He kept his anxious Marks waiting for as long as he could, but would eventually admit, with apologies and without refunds, that the loans hadn't been approved. Like this, the con man pocketed up to $1 million a year tax-free. That's over $5 million today. His misdemeanors made him plenty of enemies though, so he made a habit of talking fast and bluffing like hell. One time he conned an attorney in Miami, and the next thing Weinberg knew, the guy's tough uncle was getting ready to throw him out of a window. Panicking, Weinberg spouted out the name of every mobster he knew who could avenge him. At some point he must have hit the right name, and they let him off with a warning. Throughout his criminal career, he justified his actions with one motto: "You can't con an honest man." But in the end, Weinberg got caught out. In early 1975, he targeted estate agent Lee Schlag, who wanted a $1.9 million loan to buy a Pennsylvania dairy farm. The con started as usual, with Schlag forking over $3,500 and Weinberg stalling for as long as possible. However, Schlag smelled something fishy. He handed his paperwork over to his lawyers, who then passed it on to an FBI office, and in 1976 an investigation into London Investors was triggered. Under pressure, Weinberg started making mistakes like sending letters through regular mail, which violated federal law. He, along with Evelyn Knight, were caught. In February 1977, a grand jury indicted him on charges of conspiracy, mail fraud, and wire fraud, landing him 3 years in prison. Or so he thought. In an FBI office in Long Island, a routine memo about Weinberg's case found its way onto the desk of Agent John Good. At the time, he'd been investigating sloppy sewer construction and bribery, but his bosses had been ragging on him to catch bigger, more important crooks. Looking at the memo, he thought this Weinberg, a master trickster who talked his way in and out of any situation, could well prove useful in their increasing number of sting operations. He sought out Weinberg, and the men may well have seen something of themselves in each other. Both were from working-class Bronx families and had plenty of experience with tough guys in crime, albeit from different sides of the law. The pair struck a deal. Weinberg and Knight's sentences would be lifted, and Weinberg would get a solid salary if he cooperated with the FBI to carry out the sting of the century. Juicy, right? But before I go into that, you've gotta know what led up to this daring partnership. 5 years earlier, in 1972, the first FBI Director, General J. Edgar Hoover, passed away after serving in the role for 48 highly influential years. Just a year before, documents stolen from an FBI outlet revealed to the public that Hoover had definitely not been a knight in shining armor. He'd used his power to spearhead a string of illegal activities such as surveillance, intimidation, and blackmail. He destroyed the lives of those he deemed subversives, which could include anyone from communists to civil rights activists and gay men. To the public, it seemed that the FBI was more concerned with persecuting its critics than, doing its job. That same year, controversy beset President Richard Nixon. 5 burglars were caught snooping around the Democratic National Committee offices in the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. Turns out, they were working for the committee to re-elect the president, or CREEP for short. A fundraising organization designed to get Nixon re-elected for a second term and spy on his political enemies. America was in turmoil. The government and law enforcement were committing crimes and getting away with it. The FBI needed a new director, and Nixon knew he needed a steady, reliable hand to guide the organization and restore people's faith in it. He nominated Clarence Chief Kelly, the former head of Kansas City Police. Kelly had brought innovation and boosted public confidence and morale in its police force, and it was hoped Chief could do the same for the FBI. Kelly aimed to reform the agency, banning the illegal break-ins that had defined Hoover's approach. Instead, he shifted the focus towards undercover investigations and rooting out white-collar crime. That's nonviolent crimes like fraud, corruption, and money laundering. And Chief got the job done. From 1978 to 1980, the FBI engaged in nearly 100 separate undercover operations. In 1979 alone, investigations led to over 2,000 arrests, more than 1,000 convictions, and the recovery of $318 million in stolen property. Although the FBI didn't catch all these criminals by themselves. After all, everyone knows it takes a crook to catch a crook. Now back to Weinberg. After his meeting with John Good, the conman was assigned to work on 4 cases, initially to help track down stolen art and forgeries. In an early exploit, they put Weinberg in contact with a big Italian crook from upstate New York. Weinberg met the crook one winter, but after skimming through his stolen paintings, had to confess he knew nothing about art and would need to meet his expert. The Italian seemed nervous, suspecting it was a setup, but Weinberg put the man's mind at ease, convincing him to board his private jet from which they would fly to any airport in the state the thief desired to complete the deal. The Italian begrudgingly agreed. Before they knew it, Weinberg and the crook were up in the air with the pilot and the art expert who, in reality, were both FBI. At his feet, Weinberg had a briefcase containing what he said was $1 million, but was actually only $300. The plane was freezing, and Weinberg watched as the crook paced up and down the cabin. Getting impatient, the crook demanded to see the money. Noticing the gun in the Italian's belt, Weinberg replied,
"Sit down, you fat."
and then quickly whipped the briefcase open, enough that the Italian could see the money, but not how little was actually there. It worked. Finally, they landed on the snow-covered runway, and Weinberg waited for the pilot to put a pipe in his mouth, the signal that the FBI was about to arrest the thief. Fearing he might get caught in a gunfight, Weinberg needed an excuse to get away from the crook. So, in classic Weinberg fashion, he told the man he smelled and walked off. Then the agents leapt into action. It was a success. Despite being far from smooth sailing, Weinberg delivered on all 4 cases. Yet when it was all over, he didn't leave the FBI. Instead, he stayed on as an informant, and in doing so, rocked 70s America to its core. Why did he stay? Patriotism? Fear? Nope, he insisted he did it purely for the money. Though he was nevertheless delighted to show America what, in his words, a bunch of perverts, drunks, and crooks their politicians really were. Which brings us to the insane FBI plan that ended up catching 7 congressmen. In 1978, Good put together a top team of FBI agents and, of course, Weinberg, with the intention of crafting a scheme that would ensnare people looking to buy stolen art. Together, they came up with the idea of setting up a fake company called Abdul Enterprises in Long Island, where Weinberg would pose as the company's president, a representative of fictitious Arab sheiks who wanted to buy stolen art. In reality, the sheiks would be undercover FBI agents. In the 70s, the headlines were dominated by stories of oil barons, and Weinberg knew to play into the stereotype of the rich Middle Easterner. To catch felons in the act, they'd record their phony deals on a new technology, tape recorders, a gadget Chief Kelly was keen to implement. The FBI decided to hold a dress rehearsal for the scheme named Operation Abscam, only with a very real target, New York businessman turned shady art dealer Ron Sablowski. Weinberg had initially planned to rent a nice big suite at the Plaza Hotel, but due to budget constraints, they ended up in the hotel's smallest room. Insisting that the mark needed to be dazzled, Weinberg wanted to provide Sablowski with hotel hors d'oeuvres, but again, budget. So Weinberg went out to his local kosher deli to get a load of corned beef, potato salad, and coleslaw. The problem was, why would a sheik be eating kosher food? But Weinberg waved it off, saying they'd just pretend the sheik loved Jewish delicacies. As for the sheik himself, he was played by FBI agent turned actor Mike Dennehy, only there was another hiccup. Dennehy found that his rented robes were too small and was forced to wear only the headdress with a suit. What's more, he couldn't speak a word of Arabic. So when Sablowski sat down for their meeting, he simply grunted while Weinberg claimed he barely spoke English. And yet another faux pas, the tape recorder strapped to the bottom of the table fell to the floor partway through the meet. Thankfully, a quick-thinking agent discreetly kicked it under the couch before Sablowski had a chance to notice. The room was cramped, and the utter ridiculousness of the situation left agents unable to contain their laughter, with some having to take turns stepping outside. Weinberg explained this away by saying the sheik staff went a little crazy in the USA because they couldn't in their home country. Yet despite this absolute debacle, Sablowski wolfed down the food and accepted the money for his stolen art. Incredibly, the meeting was a success. After the bust, though, the team sensibly decided to cut back on the numbers of agents in the room, use someone more qualified to play the sheik, and add backup recording devices. Then the scams just kept coming. Thanks to Weinberg, word soon spread about the wealthy Arabs who had over $400 million to invest in shady dealings. But the miscreants taking the bait were mostly corrupt businessmen, swindlers, and low-level politicians. In other words, small time. This all changed in late '78 when the Abscam team came into contact with white-collar crook William Rosenberg. The sting began as normal, with Weinberg meeting Rosenberg to discuss investing in Abdul Enterprises. Turns out that Rosenberg was also a con man, and he was only posing as an investor. His real intent was to scam the company, only he had no idea he was being scammed himself. He was told he could earn $7 million in commissions if he helped the sheik make a $100 million investment to turn Atlantic City into the new Vegas. All the sheik needed was the guarantee that the hotel casino he was helping to build would get a gambling license. Rosenberg assured him he knew the mayor of Camden, New Jersey, Angelo Ericetti, and would be able to curry favor that way. Ericetti was hugely popular in his hometown, endearing himself to the working-class population after easing tensions during riots in '73. However, he also had a history of legal trouble, only narrowly escaping fraud and perjury charges, and according to Rosenberg, was partial to a bit of bribery. Intrigued, FBI bosses jumped at the chance to catch this much bigger fish and gave the green light to Weinberg to meet him. In their first meeting, the mayor turned out to be a foul-mouthed megalomaniac who, unsurprisingly, instantly warmed himself to the con man. Ericetti didn't beat around the bush. The mayor boasted that he could secure the sheik a casino license if he was paid $50,000 in bribes and claimed, "I'll give you Atlantic City. Without me, you do nothing." Well, Ericetti accepted the money, and from there it moved from a mid-level operation to the big time. Over the next year and a half, Ericetti unknowingly served as a middleman, hooking the FBI up with other corrupt politicians, all wanting to get their palms greased. And even though he liked the mayor, Weinberg had no intentions of sparing him. With blessings from the head honchos, the scam could also be far more elaborate. To play the part, the FBI set up a temporary residence on a 62-foot yacht that docked in several posh Florida marinas. Marks were told it was called the Left Hand, or the Corsair, and owned by the sheik. In reality, customs officials had seized the boat from doobie smugglers. In December 78, Ericetti stepped on board and finally met the legendary Sheik, now played by an agent of Lebanese descent along with Weinberg. To really sell the image, the Sheik presented Ericetti with a tribal dagger as a symbol of friendship, something that Weinberg assured him was an Arab way. Ericetti was totally wooed.
Wow.
In reality, it was an old knife they'd bought from a flea market for $2.75. Secret meetings were set up where oblivious politicians were filmed with hidden cameras and the FBI watched from an adjacent room. However, one time while preparing for a sting at the Hilton Hotel near Kennedy Airport, Ericetti showed up before all the equipment was set up. He was chatting with Weinberg and another agent when there was a sudden knock on the door. The mayor opened it and was confused to find a guy holding a ton of camera equipment. Luckily, Weinberg jumped in explaining they were shooting a TV commercial down the hall and he had the wrong door. The mayor trusted him so much that he didn't bat an eye. Then the FBI created another Sheik, Yasir Habib, who hoped to find asylum in the US. He would welcome in the politicians, but they needed the room's lighting to be so bright it was nearly blinding in order to record the meetings properly. So what did they say was the reason? That the Sheik missed the blazing heat of his homeland. Wow. How they ever got anyone, I'll never know. All the pitches followed the same script. The Sheik was worried about radicals in his home country and wanted reassurances from the congressmen that he could gain permanent sanctuary in the U.S. Anyone who passed legislation to make this happen would be handsomely rewarded. And the flies came buzzing. First up, it's Richard Kelly. He came from a humble upbringing, raised in an orphanage in Rhode Island before serving as a lawyer and eventually a congressman, the only Republican ultimately convicted in the Abscam case. His trouble began when Rosenberg introduced him to Weinberg. He was told that in exchange for helping two sheiks immigrate to the U.S., he'd receive $25,000. In a Washington townhouse, Kelly met up with Rosenberg and his mobster associate to collect the money, and upon seeing the cash said, "If I told you how poor I am, you'd cry." Then instead of putting it in his briefcase, he stuffed it into his coat pockets and marched out of the building intent on cutting Rosenberg and the mobster out of the deal. All of this was, of course, recorded. Then there was Representative John Jenrette Jr. of South Carolina. During his meeting with the agents, he was told that the Sheik would offer him $100,000 with half up front to introduce a bill allowing him to immigrate to the States. Gulping down a drink, Jenrette blurted, "I got larceny in my blood. I'd take it in a goddamn minute." Over to Michael O. Myers, a member of the Democratic Party representing Pennsylvania. It's fair to say that, like Mike Myers, this guy was a bit of an ogre. Less than 3 years after his arrival in Washington, he got in a fight at an Arlington hotel. He was celebrating his re-election with his cousin and friends when they were asked to lower their voices by staff. In response, Myers told them he was a congressman and didn't need to abide by their rules. Then he and his cousin attacked two staff members who were only 19 and 22. Myers was 35 at the time. Jeez. When police arrived on the scene, Myers' cousin pulled his trousers down. I don't know why. Anyway, Michael Ogre Myers avoided any punishment for all this, at least initially. Little did he know his brash personality had made him a prime target for the FBI to weigh in on. As per usual, Ericetti arranged a meeting for Myers, who boasted that his political influence meant he could pass an immigration bill in no time. "I'm gonna tell you something real simple and short," he said. "Money talks in this business and bull walks." At the end of the meeting, an aide pulled an envelope from a briefcase and handed it to him. Inside was a $50,000 bribe, which Myers gladly accepted.
Oh my God!
Finally, the prize pig, Senator Harrison Williams of Westfield, New Jersey, the highest-ranking official they caught. He climbed on board the yacht to seek his remuneration, and smiling politely, the Sheik explained his simple wish. He wanted to invest in land and casinos in Atlantic City and a titanium mine in Virginia. However, he was unfamiliar with American politics and finance and needed the help of an experienced congressman. Williams nodded along and told the Arab's interpreter, "You tell the Sheik I'll do all I can. You tell him I'll deliver my end." Boom. They'd got another scumbag. Problem was, after several stings, the agents had promised more bribes than they could deliver. Overall, the operation heaped up a whopping cost of $800,000 and caught one U.S. senator, 7 members of the House, and dozens of state and local officials. However, not every politician they targeted was ensnared in Weinberg's web. Republican South Dakota Senator Larry Pressler visited the sheik's entourage after being told they could help fund his ongoing campaign for the presidential nomination. However, when Pressler asked about the details, he was met with a wall of blank faces. Although they were still happy to donate money to the cause, Pressler quickly realized something was off, rejected the offer, and walked out of the townhouse. Later, an FBI director said that Pressler had performed beautifully and was praised as a hero. Pressler retorted, "It's a sad state of affairs when it's heroic to turn down a potential bribery situation." After 23 outrageous months, the FBI heard the media was about to catch wind of the story, so they asked reporters to hold off until they could wrap up some final interviews with the 100 agents involved. Eventually, on February 2, 1980, the operation was shut down and details of the sting were released to the public. Breaking on NBC Nightly News that very evening. To his shock, Ericetti finally learned he'd been a puppet for the FBI and had incriminated himself over and over again on camera. He, along with the 7 congressmen caught in the sting, were promptly arrested. The FBI knew if they wanted to nail these guys, they needed plenty of evidence, and they had it by the bucketful. In court, they played so much footage of men accepting bribes that Weinberg fell asleep on the stand. For Rosenberg and Ericetti, the 2 men who made it all possible, the hammer crashed down hard. Rosenberg was sentenced to 6 to 30 months after pleading guilty to bribing Kelly, while Ericetti was sentenced to 6 years on bribery and conspiracy charges. Ever wily, he ultimately only served 32 months. Then there was that footage of Richard Kelly stuffing money into his pockets. When shown in court, lawyers joked that Kelly's best defense would be to show the footage backwards. His actual defense was much weirder. He claimed to be taking part in his own investigation into congressional corruption and argued that the charges against him were just another attack by the establishment. Unsurprisingly, this failed to convince anyone, and in January 1981, he was convicted of bribery and conspiracy. In 1984, Kelly was sentenced to 6 to 18 months in prison, ultimately serving 13 of them. Meanwhile, the footage of Jenrette's meeting showed him staring at 5 envelopes laid out in front of him, each containing $10,000. But despite claiming to have larceny in his blood and being egged on by the agent, Jenrette didn't take any of the cash right then. Instead, he said he needed more time to disguise the money as a legal fee so he could cover his tracks. 2 days later, Jenrette's associate picked it up. Now, Jenrette was an infamous alcoholic, and his lawyer claimed he was drunk when he accepted the bribe. In court, Jenrette apologized profusely and blamed his alcoholism. The Justice Department sympathized but concluded that Jenrette had taken part in
appallingly corrupt conduct,
and that his
real crime is the incalculable damage he did to the faith of the American people.
Jenrette was sentenced to 2 years in prison and served 13 months. But once out of jail, he lost his 1980 re-election bid and, rather than be expelled, resigned from Congress. As for Michael Ogre Myers, he served more than a year in prison and was expelled from Congress. Over 40 years later, the 79-year-old Myers got in trouble again for ballot stuffing in 2022. Go back to the swamp, Michael. And finally, there was old Harrison Williams. Now, he never technically took any physical money. Instead, the sheik was to make him a silent partner with an 18% stake in the mine. In return, he'd steer government contracts to the mine, expedite immigration, and secure a share in Atlantic City casino projects. Williams tried to use the fact that he never took any cash at his trial, but the jury were unconvinced. He was found guilty and convicted and served 21 months of a 3-year prison sentence. But the FBI faced their own controversy. In their pursuit of catching white-collar criminals, they took part in entrapment. That is, inventing fake crimes that the officials wouldn't otherwise have committed. Usually, undercover sting operations catch criminals who have already broken the law or are in the middle of doing something shady. But in Abscam, the officials weren't even suspected of anything beforehand, and none of them had done anything illegal before meeting the fake sheik. The whole thing was about encouraging them to commit crimes rather than catching them in the act. Of course, the FBI defended their actions, saying senior officials checked the tapes to ensure their undercover agents behaved properly, and every cash payoff was monitored on TV by an attorney from a nearby room. If the attorney deemed the agent too bold, they'd phone him and tell him to ease up. Although there's no getting around the fact that it wasn't the FBI who directly tested Congress members' honesty. It was the middlemen like Rosenberg and Ericetti. They persuaded officials to meet the Sheikh's people using both legal and illegal incentives. Public opinion on the whole mess was pretty divided, but despite criticism, the FBI moved forward with the prosecutions. By 1981, federal grand juries had indicted 1 U.S. senator, 6 U.S. representatives, and other local officials from Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey. But was this truly justice? Well, in defense of Abscam, these congressmen got themselves tangled up in confrontationalist crimes, victimless offenses where everyone involved knowingly breaks the law, or offenses where the victims don't even know they're involved, like fraud. These types of crimes are very tough to prove without sting operations like Abscam. So, with all the congressmen sentenced, was this the end of government corruption? As you can imagine, Congress weren't too pleased with the FBI making them look like a bunch of dopes. So in 1983, they drafted a bill, the Undercover Operations Act, to put limits on undercover work by law enforcement. Unfortunately for them, they failed to get it through. But if that's so, why don't these kinds of stings happen anymore? Well, while Abscam was happening, the Church Committee was formed in '75 off the back of the Watergate scandal, led by Happy Chappy Senator Frank Church. This committee investigated the many controversies and abuses of power carried out by government agencies like the FBI and CIA, who were caught spying on civil rights activists, planning to assassinate foreign leaders, and running the sinister MK Ultra brainwashing program. The final report was issued in '76 and included 96 recommendations. Its aftermath found agencies stripped of many of their powers, especially when it came to investigating politicians. In 1978, President Jimmy Carter signed the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, requiring law enforcement to request warrants for wiretapping and surveillance, which makes it pretty darn tricky if you're trying to catch someone in a sting. So in answer to your question, politicians don't get caught because they've made a law that makes it near impossible. But whatever happened to old Mel Weinberg? Well, since he was now too famous for swindling, he moved to Miami and worked as a private investigator before retiring in 1994 to Titusville, Florida. Looking back fondly on his Abscam days, he held on to copies of the videotapes and enjoyed watching them from time to time until glaucoma caused his eyesight to fail. Back in 2017, when asked if he had any regrets, Weinberg said,
Not really. I've had a good life, a charmed life. I should have been dead a long time ago.
In 2013, American Hustle was released, a film based on Abscam starring Christian Bale as Irving Rosenfeld, a character clearly inspired by Weinberg. After seeing the movie, Weinberg quipped, "I wouldn't be seen dead in a green jacket." Finally, the crook's life came to an end in 2018 at the grand old age of 93, leaving behind the legacy of a master trickster who revealed the dark soul of American politics. Phew, pretty wild, right? If you liked this video, you'll love my others on con men like Kevin McKeever and Tommy Carmichael. Go on, click one. Oh, and thanks for watching.